little book here from the Library of Congress that contains the will of James Finney Baxter, where he mandates that the city of Boston build a New England pantheon to commemorate the principles and achievements of the pioneers whose ideals were the seed of free government. I am the 9th or 10th generation from the great state of Maine. And the Baxters of Maine are well known there because they were pioneers as politicians coming from their hearts in office. They championed the earth, the animals, the women, and the water in office. James Finney Baxter as mayor of Portland 6 times and one of the major philanthropists of the state of Maine who gifted the state of Maine libraries and parks and all manner of things. And Percival Proctor Baxter, his son, who was governor of Maine and who gave Mount Katahdin and 200,000 acres to the people of Maine to be held forever wild. They gave away their fortunes to the people of Maine, whom they loved. He was concerned at that time in 1920 that the Pilgrims and Puritans had been misunderstood, misrepresented, and that he was establishing this pantheon to be sure that their intent, their heart, their spirit, and their ideals would be understood so that the founding of this country could be something of inspiration to all of humanity, not something shrouded in misconception and misunderstanding.
I think that the Pilgrims have been greatly misunderstood.
The ideals of the early pioneers to New England have given to the nation many of its noblest characteristics, which must be cherished and preserved if it is to lead as the exemplar of liberty, justice, and brotherhood among nations of the world. We have reached a period when our high hopes for the future welfare of this country may fail of fruition.
If those ideals are not immutable, an ideal like all men, all people are created equal, if that is an eternal verity, then we should honor it and respect it in all people. However, if it is not, then you can manipulate what that means until it means nothing.
Whereas you are to become a body politic, using amongst yourselves civil government, and are not furnished with any persons of special eminency above the rest, to be chosen by you into office of government. Let your wisdom and godliness appear, not only in choosing such persons as do entirely love and will diligently promote the common good, but also in yielding unto them all due honor and obedience in their lawful administrations, not beholding in them the ordinariness of their persons, but God's ordinance for your good.
We must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold the familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work, our community as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us.
In the evolution of American democracy, there have been two great syntheses. One happened here in Plymouth, Massachusetts, in the first 50 years of peace and friendship between the Mayflower Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Indians. This time of coming together gave birth to a new way of seeing and thinking that was not European, was not Native American, was a synthesis into something new. The first synthesis of European and indigenous thinking occurred during the extraordinary half-century of peace and friendship at Plymouth Plantation, during which the Pilgrim separatists, who defied the King of England and sought political and religious freedom, shared a spiritual connection with the Native Americans they encountered and considered them equal under English law. 4 months after the Mayflower arrived here in Plymouth, they were in a meeting, and Samoset, a Native American from Maine, came into their settlement and spoke to them and said, "Welcome, Englishmen." Shortly after that, they met with Massasoit, the Pokanoket sachem, with whom they created a peace treaty that was to last 54 years.
The Pilgrims considered all agreements to be sacred, and that applied whether it was to other Europeans or to Native Americans. It was sacred.
We have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them, and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them. Not only the greatest king amongst them, called Massasoit, but also all the princes and peoples round about us, have either made suit unto us, or been glad of any occasion to make peace with us, so that 7 of them at once have sent their messengers to us to that end. So that there is now great peace amongst the Indians themselves, which was not formerly, neither would have been but for us. And we for our parts walk as peaceably and safely in the wood as in the highways in England. We entertain them familiarly in our houses, and they as friendly bestowing their venison on us.
In 1675, Metacom's rebellion, also known as King Philip's War, terminated the half-century of peace and friendship established by treaty in 1621. Well-armed and well-prepared, Metacom set in motion the bloodiest war per capita in American history. In the end, the settlers prevailed. The Indians shifted from friend to enemy and essentially disappeared from New England history. The war set the stage for the denigration and fear of the Indian and led, ultimately, to their treatment as second-class citizens throughout North America. The Plymouth paradigm was destroyed.
As an American Indian, and I look back at these days of our first history, I just think it's a shame that the Plymouth paradigm did not endure.
I believe that they got along pretty good because they did not show any aggressiveness. They were people that were looking for a place to be with God, according to their teachings.
The Plymouth paradigm, as I understand it, was based on the idea of sharing, and everything was inclusive. Indians were not left out. They were part of the process, and they felt free to make themselves part of the process.
What also became part of the United States Constitution was the Great Law of the Iroquois, the second great synthesis. And I have a little bracelet on here that represents the Hiawatha belt of the Great Law of the Iroquois. And that is the coming together of the 5 warring tribes under the Tree of Peace. And this Tree of Peace has white roots of peace that go out around the world, calling people into this higher way of thinking that the Great Law brought, and that the Great Law brought into the concepts that are embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. Iroquois chiefs were invited to the Declaration of Independence debates in Philadelphia in 1775.
The chiefs of the League of 5 Nations shall be mentors of the people for all time. The thickness of their skin shall be 7 spans, which is to say that they shall be proof against anger, offensive action, and criticism. Their hearts shall be full of peace and goodwill, and their minds filled with a yearning for the welfare of the people of the League. With endless patience, they shall carry out their duty. Their firmness shall be tempered with a tenderness for their people. Neither anger nor fury shall find lodging in their minds, and all their words and actions shall be marked by calm deliberation.
You have to remember that for 150 years prior to the Revolution, European settlers had been living in America. And in addition to assimilating the different European cultures into a different American culture, they had also assimilated the Native American thought process and had become much more naturalistic, so that by the time the Revolution came around, there was indeed a true American character, which is really very different from the European character and spirit.
James Finney Baxter had a vision for humanity, that we were capable of operating according to our higher conscience, and that a government that would nurture the flowering of the individual's gifts and talents and dreams and desires was his dream. And it was also the dream of the founders of America, the Mayflower Pilgrims, who brought these principles and ideals here, as well as the Puritans and others who came to early New England, who met with the Native Americans who embodied these ideals, and our other founders, the 1776 drafters of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. They had this dream for humanity.
James P. Baxter was one of the leading scholars on the 17th and early 18th century exploration and settlement of New England. This was a passion of his that he expressed not only with deep and extensive research in original records and visits to historic sites here in New England, but also frequent trips to Europe and particularly to England, where he did extensive research in the period English archives.
It was the Gilded Era, a time of robber barons, gold rushes, and manifest destiny. The American Indian had been subdued, many had been pushed west and relegated to reservations. The importance of the Native American in the evolution of American democracy and the American mind and spirit had been lost, as the European materialist mindset under the doctrine of discovery steamrolled across the continent. The principles and ideals articulated by Pilgrim and Puritan leaders Robinson and Winthrop, equal and just laws serving the common good, had become tools of dominance, separation, and ultimately world power. In 1846, a young transcendentalist and abolitionist refused to pay his poll tax. Henry David Thoreau spent a night in jail for this offense and subsequently wrote the treatise Civil Disobedience. Thoreau was a rational mystic who saw humanity's potential to operate from his higher conscience with reverence for the natural world, freedom to challenge a government gone astray, and the ability to actualize the ideals of liberty, equality, and justice for all. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt, a privileged member of the ruling class, was elected president. He fought the monopolies that were running the country. As a progressive, he used the power of government to regulate big business, protect workers and the environment, and clean up corrupt politics. He highlighted the immense importance of nature to the human spirit with the establishment of the national parks system. In the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, it was believed that the American Indian had no religion, no redeeming characteristics. Edward S. Curtis was a friend of Roosevelt's and was funded by J.P. Morgan. Curtis dedicated his life to photographing and recording the vanishing Native American cultures in the West to show the world their profound spirituality and the importance of their way of life. In the 1830s, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter portrayed the Puritans as heartless bigots whose strict religious views were law. The myth of Rousseau's noble savage took hold. Washington Irving in Philip of Poconoket, Howard Zinn in The People's History of the United States, and others have continued the trend to the present day. By 1920, the 300th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower, sentiment in the United States had shifted. Rather than hold high the lofty ideals of the Pilgrims and the Puritans, they were seen as intolerant, rigid, and hateful. The coming of the white man had been recast as an invasion of materialism, displacing a romanticized indigenous culture living in balance with each other and their environment. New England history and the origin story of the United States is now a morass of misinformation, revisionist history, distorted oral history, opinion, guilt, anger, shame, and blame. James Finney Baxter saw a vital need to keep the historical facts and the ideals of the vision that became the United States available to the population, incoming immigrants as well as descendants of the first comers. He thought a bricks and mortar building would preserve the principles and ideals that animated the early settlers. He believed that by the year 2020, his bequest would have reached $1 million, and a foundation would have been laid for such an edifice, a New England pantheon.
When Percival P. Baxter died in 1969, his will included a provision that the city of Boston was to receive $200,000 to be added to whatever funds his father had given to create the New England Pantheon.
The 1960s brought resistance to the emptiness and materialism of the status quo and an interest in the spiritual ways of the Native Americans and the civil rights of the African American.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
By 1970, the angry voice of the American Indian began to be heard and felt deep within the American psyche. A wrong had been done. A culture had been decimated. The first Americans were ignored, feared, and deprived of their land and self-respect. Rather than liberty, equality, and justice, the corruption of the principles and ideals of the founders of New England and those of the Native Americans they encountered, by money, power, and progress had prevailed and continues to prevail today. The United States struggles to be proud of its founders and the promises we made in the freedom documents of the United States, the Mayflower Compact, the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and the Emancipation Proclamation. But that pride is tarnished by our inability to live up to these promises. The United States has lost its self-respect and the respect of the world.
We're making this sacrifice on behalf of those that don't have a voice, the silent nation, the animals and the trees and the land and the water.
But we're in the time of prophecy, and our ancestors said the time would come when we would be reduced to almost nothing. But there will be certain things that will begin to happen in our world, and the spiritual resurrection and the Aboriginal knowledge and wisdom of this land would come up, and we would help our brothers and sisters to understand who they are, where do they come from, why are they here, and where are we going when we leave this place. And when we understand that, it's true. We're all brothers and sisters. We're all beautiful. We all have something to offer while we are here in this time.
There is an opportunity now, at the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower, and in 2030, the 400th anniversary of the founding of Boston. It is time to move forward. It is time to take the inspiration of the intercultural syntheses of the first 50 years of peace and friendship modeled by Plymouth Colony and the melding of the great law of the Iroquois into the Constitution to the next level. It is time to respect, honor, and understand the American Indian point of view and way of life. It is time to welcome the visionary Indian to the table through an open-hearted and open-minded invitation to sit in council together and explore how we are going to realize the principles and ideals so treasured by the founders of this nation, by James Finney Baxter and his son Percival, by the American Indian, and by all people who dream of bringing universal liberty, equality, and justice from the realm of possibility into actualization. It is time for a third great synthesis.
I believe that if the Indians and the white man would sit down and talk, it would be a much better world.
It has to come from the heart, from the spirit, from the mind of people of conscience.
There's only one creator, which is leading us all. And that's what makes us all one.
When that reconciliation catches fire, it will jump the oceans.
We do have to take care of Mother Earth and clean up our ways and respect one another and love one another. That's all it takes.
See the day, because it starts with you and it starts with me, and it has begun this moment, and nothing will stop it, because this sacred spirit fire wants to heal the entire human race, and it shall be done.
Once we recognize the role of the American Indian in the evolution of the United States of America, the dream for humanity carried to these shores by the early settlers of New England and Virginia will be realized, in alignment with the vision of my great-great-grandfather, James Finney Baxter, that we lead the world as exemplars in liberty, justice, and equality. Until that time, the United States, like a three-legged stool missing one of its legs, is out of balance without the Native American at the table.